The morning of June 25, 1876, began like any other, but it would soon become etched in history. As the 7th Cavalry marched toward the Little Bighorn, Giovanni Martini, an orderly trumpeter, received orders that would lead him directly into the heart of one of the most pivotal battles of the American Indian Wars. With a clear sense of impending danger, Martini, under the command of General Custer, joined the troop in their march toward the village of the Sioux. Little did he know, the fate of his comrades and the outcome of the battle would soon be decided by events set into motion that very morning. It was just before 8 o'clock when Captain Benteen summoned Martini and gave him his orders. The regiment had paused near the divide separating the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn, taking a moment to rest after a night of marching, completely unaware of the deadly conflict that was about to unfold. It was clear to us that a large number of Indians were nearby. For the past 2 days, we had passed through abandoned villages and followed a well-worn trail leading from the Rosebud. On the 24th, we discovered the remains of buffalo, recently killed and skinned. I approached the general directly and reported in. He merely glanced at me and gave a nod. At the time, he was speaking with an Indian scout known as Bloody Knife, who was describing a large village in the valley, a settlement with several hundred teepees and around 5,000 Sioux. I took a seat a short distance away and listened to their conversation. While I couldn't comprehend what the scout said, I gathered the gist of it from the general's questions and his exchanges with the interpreter. The general that morning wore a blue-gray flannel shirt, buckskin trousers, and tall boots. On his head was a standard company hat. His blonde hair was trimmed shorter than before, not too short, but no longer hanging in curls on his shoulders as it once did. Soon the general mounted his horse and rode bareback through the camp, speaking quietly with the officers and giving them instructions. By 8:30, the troops were prepared to move, with the scouts setting out ahead of us. We followed about 15 minutes later. I rode about 2 yards behind the general. The column moved at a walking pace until, about 2 hours later, we reached a deep ravine and stopped. The general then left us and went ahead with the scouts. I stayed behind with the adjutant. At this time, the general climbed to the crow's nest on the divide to search for the Sioux village that Bloody Knife had described. He was away for quite some time, and upon his return, he was informed about fresh pony tracks nearby and that the Sioux had spotted us in the ravine. Immediately, he ordered me to sound the officer's call, which I did. This signaled that he understood the Sioux could no longer be caught off guard, and there was no point in maintaining silence. For the prior 2 days, no trumpet calls had been sounded, and every effort had been made to keep our movements concealed. But now, everything had changed. The officers arrived quickly and held a serious discussion with the general. None of the enlisted men were permitted to approach them, but shortly afterward, they parted ways and returned to their respective units. We soon resumed our march and, around midday, crossed the divide. Not long after, the general said something to the adjutant that I couldn't catch and gestured toward the left. Within moments, Captain Benteen, along with 3 troops, left the column and headed in the direction the general had indicated. I was curious about their destination because my troop was among those with him. The rest of the regiment continued on in 2 columns. Colonel Reno, leading 3 troops, was on the left, while General Custer, with 5 troops, moved on the right. I rode directly behind the general. We followed the path of a small stream that flowed toward the Little Bighorn River. Reno's column advanced along the left bank, while our group stayed on the right. Throughout the march, scouts rode back and forth, delivering information. The general would often listen, then gallop ahead briefly to survey the area. At times, Reno's column was several hundred yards away. At other moments, it came closer. On those occasions, the general signaled with his hat for them to cross over to our side. Eventually, we came upon an old teepee containing the body of a deceased warrior. It had been set ablaze by the Indian scouts. Nearby, on a small hill, one of the scouts, Fred Gerard, spotted some Indians between us and the river. He alerted the general, pointing out that they appeared to be fleeing. The general instructed the Indian scouts to pursue them, but they refused. The general then signaled for Colonel Reno, who rode over. The general directed the adjutant, Cook, to order Reno to cross the river and attack the Indian village, promising to support him with the entire regiment. He explained his plan to push the Indians from the other end and said he would have Benteen move quickly to strike them at the center. Reno, leading his 3 troops, immediately set off at a trot, heading toward the river. We followed for a few hundred yards before veering right, moving downriver. We too went at a gallop, stopping only once to water the horses. The general appeared to be in a great rush. After covering about a mile or two, we reached a large hill that overlooked the valley. We rode around its base and paused. The general then took me with him as we ascended to the top of the hill, where we could see the village in the valley across the river. It was a large village, though we couldn't see all of it from that vantage point, a fact we didn't realize at the time. Several hundred teepees were clearly visible. There were no warriors in sight. All we saw were some women and children playing, along with a few dogs and ponies. The general appeared both surprised and pleased, remarking that the Indians must be in their tents, resting. While we were on the hill, we didn't spot any sign of Reno's column. I'm certain the general didn't see them either, as he scanned the area thoroughly with his glasses, only stating that we had got them this time. He turned in the saddle, removed his hat, and waved it so that the men of the command, who were halted at the foot of the hill, could see him. He shouted to them, "Hurrah, boys! We've got them! We'll finish them off and then head back to our station." Afterward, the general and I rode back down to where the troops were, and he spoke briefly with the adjutant, telling him what he had observed. We continued riding quickly until we reached a large ravine leading toward the river, where the general pointed down and then called me over. This was about a mile downstream from where we had climbed the hill, and we had been riding at a trot and galloped the entire way. It was approximately 3 miles from where we had left Reno's trail. The general said, "Orderly, I need you to take a message to Colonel Benteen. Ride as fast as you can and tell him to hurry. It's a large village, and I want him to be quick and bring the ammunition packs." He didn't stop while speaking to me, and I replied, "Yes, sir," then reined in my horse. The adjutant called out, "Wait, orderly, I'll give you a message." Then he stopped and quickly wrote it down in a small book, tearing out the page before handing it to me. He then said, "Now, orderly, ride as fast as you can to Colonel Benteen. Take the same trail we came down. If there's time and no danger, come back, but otherwise, stay with your company." My horse was quite tired, but I set off as fast as I could. The last I saw of the command, they were descending into the ravine. The gray horse troop was in the middle, galloping ahead. The adjutant had instructed me to retrace our path, so within a few minutes, I found myself back on the same hill where the general and I had earlier observed the village. However, before I reached the top, I heard gunfire from behind. Turning around, I saw Indians, some of them waving buffalo robes and others shooting. They had been lying in ambush. Just before I reached the hill, I encountered Boston Custer, riding swiftly. Upon seeing me, he pulled his horse to a stop and called out, "Where's the general?" I pointed behind me and replied, "He's just beyond that next ridge." He then hurried on. That was the last time he was ever seen alive. Upon reaching the hill, I looked down to see Reno's battalion engaged in battle. No more than 10 or 15 minutes had passed since the general and I had been on that hill, and at that time there were no Indians in sight. Now, however, there were many of them circling around and shooting at Reno's men, who were dismounted and in a skirmish line. I could not estimate the number of Indians. There were many. I didn't have the time to stay and observe the fight. I had to move on to Colonel Benteen. The last I saw of Reno's men, they were in the valley, retreating as the line fell back. Some Indians noticed me, and they immediately began firing at me. Several shots were aimed at me, 4 or 5, I think, but I was fortunate and wasn't hit. My horse was struck in the hip, though I didn't realize it until later. It was a very hot day, and my horse was overheating, so I pushed forward as quickly as I could. I had no idea where Colonel Benteen was or where to search for him, but I knew I needed to find him. I retraced our path to the spot where we had watered our horses, scanning the area for Colonel Benteen. Before long, I saw his command approaching. At that point, I was riding at a slow trot. My horse was exhausted, and I kept searching for Colonel Benteen. As soon as I spotted them, I waved my hat and urged my horse forward, but he couldn't move any faster. It wasn't long, though, before I met Colonel Benteen. He was riding ahead of his troops, accompanied only by his orderly trumpeter at a brisk trot. The closest officer to him was Captain Weir, leading his troop about 200 or 300 yards behind. I saluted, handed Colonel Benteen the message, and informed him of the general's report that there was a large village and that he should hurry. He asked, "Where is the general now?" I replied that the Indians we had seen were fleeing, and I assumed that by then he had charged through the village. I was about to mention that Major Reno was also engaged, but he interrupted me. He asked, "What's wrong with your horse?" I responded, "I think he's just exhausted." The colonel said, "Exhausted? Look at his side," and then I noticed the blood from the wound. Colonel Benteen remarked, "You're fortunate it was the horse and not you." By that time, Captain Weir had joined us, and Colonel Benteen gave him the message to read before instructing me to return to my company. He did not issue any orders to Captain McDougall, who was leading the rear guard, nor to Lieutenant Matthey, who was overseeing the packs. I clarified this in Chicago in 1879 during the Court of Inquiry, but I wasn't fluent in English at the time, and they misunderstood me, leading them to report that I had received an order for Captain McDougall. That, however, was incorrect. They provided me with another horse, and I rejoined my troop, riding alongside them. The pack train wasn't far behind, maybe a mile, and the mules were making their way along, some walking, some trotting, and others running. We moved ahead faster than the pack train, and soon they were out of sight, though we could still see their dust. As the day wore on, the chaos of battle unfolded rapidly. Giovanni Martini, now a witness to the unimaginable, pressed forward through the chaos, his horse wounded, and the very survival of his comrades at stake. The frantic ride to deliver crucial messages to Colonel Benteen would be just one of many moments that defined the uncertainty and tragedy of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. By the time the dust settled, Martini's account, though filled with personal confusion and urgency, would serve as a sobering reminder of the perilous fate awaiting those caught in the crossfire of war, a fate that not all would survive.